Started here in about 30 seconds or so. Give everyone a chance to get settled. Just making sure. Thank you all for coming today. We have a very full agenda and some unique circumstances here in Washington, D.C. with the Metro. For those that perhaps aren't in the room or hadn't heard the news, but I think late yesterday around 4 p.m. Eastern there was an announcement about fully shutting down the Metro trains for an emergency and safety inspection today. So I think that's made it hard for those that use the Metro either to get to the meeting or commute into D.C., but I think we'll have a lot more council members on the phone today than we typically would have. Like to remind everybody to speak clearly into their microphones and silence their cell phones or turn them off, please, particularly today as we have 5 pieces of work to vote on, and I think we'll end up with a significant number of folks on the phone. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Goldthorpe to call our meeting to order officially.
Thanks, John. Oops. That's the first time that's happened. It's going to be a day of many firsts. And I will say that if you're here, it probably means you never got the news from yesterday. And I really admire you for making it in. And as John said, we'll have a lot more people on the bridge. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming in today. And as John said, we have a number of things to vote on, and we'll just get right to it. So, John, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Any opening comments?
Yeah. If I could, again, welcome, and for those that made other plans around Metro, thanks for doing so. For those that took advantage to participate over the wonderful capabilities of broadband and many of the companies that provide capabilities here. Thanks so much to you out there in the ether. This is the 4th meeting of the CSRIC under the 5th charter, and we're very much looking forward to getting this status update on where a couple of working groups are. I've seen some of the slides that we're going to hear today, and I'm really excited to get a better understanding. And I just from the slides themselves know that a lot of work has been put into this, and we're excited about that because these are important topics. Working Group 1 today, we'll be talking about evolving 911 services, and we're expecting to hear recommendations that would mitigate the problem of PSAP call transfers, or the misroute of a 911 call that happens to be on one side of the border between 2 PSAPs, but connected by the cell phone tower that would be associated with the other PSAP, and what regularly incurs is a 30-second to 2-minute delay as the handoff is negotiated in areas that don't have that automated. We're expecting to hear some of the work that PSAPs can do with providers and the rest of the ecosystem to ensure that the Master Street Adjust guides and the GAS systems cover all the areas where cell sector coverage may lead to that kind of border issue. This will come up with best practices, potentially SOPs, and address better ways to ensure that the occurrence of those misroutes is minimized, but also where that invariably will occur around borders that is streamlined. So we're looking forward to getting that snapshot today. The second, Working Group 2 was asked to look at emergency alerting platforms, and I think we're going to hear 2 reports from Working Group 2 today. One, actions and best practices to improve WIA security. This is an ongoing work that we've asked the CSRIC to do to improve security here, and this will focus today, I think, on the C interface. or how WEA gets the alerts from the iPod system. And second, to hear from the group on how to protect against the exploitation of vulnerabilities in carrier networks and in practices and ops of the state and local emergency management systems, so that WEA message data can be protected on cellular handsets. And that is going to look at new and evolving technology, and then be followed by a second report that will focus on device-based geo-targeting and putting some teeth into the best approximate geo-targeting standards that were recommended by CSRIC 4. Included in that, best practices for social media use, or the social media techniques, I should say, among emergency managers, and desirable uses for and feasible implementations of targeted community feedback, that many back-to-one communication that is increasingly useful in wide-scale disasters. Working Group 3, again, emergency alerting systems, will present recommendations to the Commission on how we can follow up on the CSRIC 4 EAS best practices and achieve effective implementation of those best practices, and an assurance at the Commission level that, and for the nation, that those best practices have been implemented. And Working Group 6 will follow on secure hardware, particularly looking at the supply chain vulnerabilities around secure hardware, and a follow-up from what the Technology Advisory Council worked on last year and reported out in December. Finally, the last group, Working Group 7, has been working on cybersecurity workforce and taking the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education work roles and matrixing that, if you will, to how that would apply to the commercial communication sector, and that is never hasn't been any more important than it is today, with cyber attacks continuing to increase. We all need to be vigilant in getting ahead of this. So looking at how to be effective but also efficient in addressing the cyber challenge is something we're very interested in. And I think Working Group 5 on cybersecurity information sharing will give us an update as well. Is that right?
Yes. An update, how to vote.
Updates from all.
Yeah, and then as with the others, we'll go through and get a sense of where they're at. Finally, before the presentations begin, I'd like to announce a new addition to CSRIC 5, a new problem set. We're establishing Working Group number 9 around Wi-Fi security. We're asking this group to look into developing security best practices for enterprise networks and devices utilizing Wi-Fi spectrum bands. We really want to focus on the enterprise piece. It is increasingly clear that there are vulnerabilities that cyber criminals have figured out ways to exploit, and we want to make sure that enterprises have a clear understanding of FCC guidance in this space, but also a clear understanding of what are the techniques that one can use to aggressively defend their enterprise Wi-Fi networks. So we would like Working Group 9 to take up that challenge, and we'll be looking to identify a chair for that and co-chair in the next couple of weeks. Finally, I'd like to thank all the Working Group chairs. You're the ones that really drive this group of very talented folks, but talented folks that all have daytime jobs, to a useful product, a useful set of recommendations for us that really do change the telecommunications environment in very positive ways. So thank you for your leadership. We appreciate that. And the public-private partnership that is the magic of CSRIC couldn't happen without your committed and effective leadership. Thanks.
Thank you, Admiral Simpson. I share your comments here, welcoming CSRIC 5 to our first 2016 meeting as well. Even with the transportation issue we were dealt last night, one of the big things that really motivated us to continue to have this meeting, of course, is the important work that the chairs and the committees did and the 5 pieces of work that we have to vote on, as well as the updates from the other working groups. So an awful lot of work in a collaborative spirit has gone into these recommendations, and getting them ratified today was an important part of continuing the meeting. So we have a fairly large agenda today, so I anticipate we'll use all the allotted time. Maybe not, but I think in the past we've not had to do that, so I just want to let everybody know that I think we might end up going to closer to 5 p.m. tonight. Suzanne distributed the 5 working group papers and recommendations to the council back on Thursday, March 3rd. That's the content that'll get briefed on and be voted on by the council members. I hope everyone has had the opportunity to review the material and provide comments back to the chairs and the committee as appropriate. There are a number of working groups we'll vote on. Admiral Simpson touched on those, working group 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7. Just to put a comment in on 7 around our cybersecurity workforce, I recently saw a quote that said that right now in the United States, there's 200,000 unfilled cyber jobs. And the projection by 2020 is there to be 2 million worldwide cyber jobs unfilled. So, that working group is not necessarily characteristic of CSRIC in the past, but it's a very, very important one in terms of where we're heading. In addition to the 5 working groups that we'll vote on, we'll hear updates from the other working groups in terms of their progress towards their goals and where they are, so council members can comment on that progress and ask questions. I think for each presentation, we'll allow approximately 15 minutes to either present their recommendation to the council for vote or their updates. And as always, we'll leave time for council members to ask questions either here in the room or on the phone. When we vote on these 5 papers, we'll use the Roberts Rules forum, which is yay, nay. And we're going to have to do things a little different today because of so many folks on the phone. So normally where we'd go around and introduce ourselves, we're going to do a little different today and take roll call so that we know that we have enough council members here for a quorum, which I think based on what I have seen and know we do, but we're going to take an official roll call. There are 3 advanced and pre-approved council rep substitutes today that are either with us in the room or on the phone, and when we do the roll call, I'd ask that you respond on behalf of who you're representing that you're here with us. So, Suzanne, I'm going to turn it over to you for you and Teresa to do a roll call and ensure that we have an established quorum not only in the room but on the phone.
Okay. Please just say yes or present once I say your name. Mark Oness.
Present.
Donna Bethay-Murphy. Brad Blanken.
Present.
Bill Bonney. Kent Bressy. Howard Brown.
Here.
Michael Brown. Bill Check. Abendra Chivolka.
Here.
It's not working.
Somebody's got their
We've got a
volume
hot mic. If all the folks who aren't speaking but are joining us by phone could please mute your instruments.
Tony Cole. Craig Donaldson.
Present.
Dale Drew. Andy Ellis.
Present.
Jeff England. Laurie Flaherty.
Present. Good afternoon.
Peter Fonash.
Present.
Trey Forgetti.
Present.
Hargety. Bob Gessner. Dana Golub.
Present.
Cheryl Greathouse. Thomas Hickey. Rodney Joffe. Brian Joseph. Kim Keever.
Present.
Elise Kim. Willie King. James Lanau.
Present.
Kyle Malady.
Rob Morris from Verizon sitting in for Kyle.
Jennifer Manor.
Here.
Sam Matheny.
Here.
Robert Mayer.
Present.
Danny McPherson.
Sean Wilson for Danny McPherson.
Joe Meyer.
Penny Rogers for Joe Meyer.
Susan Miller.
Present.
Joel Molinoff.
Here.
Micah Reardon.
Present.
Mark Pace.
Present.
Allison Peacock.
Present.
Brian Peretti.
Ed Roback for Brian.
Richard Perlato. Jonathan Powell. Rod Rasmussen.
Present.
Pat Roberts. Francisco Sanchez.
Present.
William Shelley.
Present.
Bill Smith.
Present.
Gary Smith.
On the phone bridge.
Scott Summers.
Present.
Steve Souter. Dorothy Spears Dean.
Present on the bridge.
Roger Stone. Maurice Tozay. Rayo Vassaretti.
Present.
Tim Walden.
Here on the bridge.
And Scott Weber.
Present.
We
Thank you,
definitely have a
Suzanne.
quorum.
Thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate that. So we have a quorum, and we're going to get started with our working group presentations. As everyone has seen in the agenda, we purposefully put an order up front of the 5 working groups with the content that the council has to vote on today, and then we'll come back around to the work groups for their general updates. Please note that we'll do the presentation and then take questions from the council in the room and on the phone. We'll use the time-honored method of placing your tent card on the side. If you have a question, I'll look for those in the room, and then I'll turn it to the phone today, as I always do, and we've got a lot of folks on the phone. So our first working group is Evolving 911 Services, which has a recommendation that the council will vote on after their presentation. So I'll turn it over to Jeff Cohen and Susan Sherwood.
Hello, I'm Susan, and I didn't hear Jeff on the phone. Okay.
I'm on the phone, Susan.
Ah, there you are. Okay, great. All right. Oops. Okay. So we're here today with a report on our Task 1 that was due for vote at this CSRIC. And basically, it was to review public safety and industry best practices and standard operating procedures on legacy, traditional IP-based, transitional IP-based, and next-generation 911 systems for rerouting 911 calls between PSAPs due to the use of cell sectors to primary route the 911 calls. And then also were necessary to identify gaps and make recommendations toward optimizing PSAP reroutes. That report and recommendations was delivered to the board on February 24th and is to be voted on today. As I said, we did review all of the best practices and standard operating procedures that we could find. And we also looked at interjurisdictional coordination on MSAG and GIS. With regard to SMS and MMS, interim text to 911 call routing, after some discussion, the work group decided that would best be handled under Task 2 on location-based routing. Okay, so Task 2, we started work on that on Friday, March 11th. And that task is to study and make recommendations on architectural, technical, operational standards and security requirements, including cybersecurity, of location-based routing that uses latitude and longitude information or other location identification methods to determine routing to the appropriate PSAP for a 911 call. And then we're also to explore and report on the pros and cons of the various sources of location information available for location-based routing, and the potential reliability and accuracy of those sources, and the transition path to location-based routing of 911 calls from legacy, for all the types, the legacy, the transitional, and the next-gen 911 systems. And in particular, identify the roles and responsibilities of key stakeholders involved in supporting 911 calls and identify existing and future standards to support the transition. That report with the guidelines and the recommendations will be due for the September 14th CSRIC. These are the work group members. They have not changed from the task one, with the exception of, and I don't have it on the slide, but it will be on the next time, Fred White from Laser was just added for our Friday call. So I will get that updated. Okay, so on task one, we delivered it to the FCC and the CSRIC board on February 24th. We received no comments or edits prior to this meeting on that report. We reviewed 51 existing legacy standards and best practices from prior CSRICs, reports to Congress, PSAPs, NENA, and the FCC that either directly or indirectly impacted call routing and rerouting. 6 of those best practices were valid and of continued relevance. That's section 5.3.1 in the report. 6 other best practices required modifications to be relevant in today's 911 environment. 5.3.2 in section. And then we created 11 new best practices developed to optimize call routing and rerouting. And a lot of those, in response to Admiral Simpson, a lot of those had to do with more interjurisdictional cooperation when doing the call routing up front, so that they could, in particular where the cell towers maybe cross PSAP boundaries, or they covered more than one PSAP within that coverage area, even within that same like county or state. And then also for them to cooperate more on the GIS boundaries in their systems, so that they did not stop at their jurisdictional boundary, that they actually maybe covered a little bits of the neighboring jurisdictions where the cell tower coverage would be, so they'd have a better idea when a call came in on where to route it or reroute it when they got it. And then also to look at, to use periodically, to use the data from their calls and their reroutes to relook at the call routing, the initial call routing decisions that they made.
So essentially, not leaving the boundary challenges to serendipity.
Yes.
Active management of boundaries.
Correct.
That include regular measurements around where misroutes are occurring, and where it makes sense, adjustments made to PSAP boundaries within their call distribution systems, their dispatch systems, to make sure that we're driving towards a path that would reduce the incidence
Yes.
of those, but also when they occur, to make sure that there are processes in place, PSAP to PSAP, for as efficient a passing the call on to the right PSAP as possible.
That's exactly right.
Does part of that include ensuring that GIS products don't end within each of the PSAPs at the county line?
That is one of the recommendations, has to do with making sure that they get surrounding, at least the next surrounding city kind of around their boundaries, to make sure that they can they can see past their jurisdictional lines.
With the same fidelity and in the same computer-aided dispatch,
Right.
so they're not having to, where those higher occurrence of misroutes occur, they're not having to consult a different map somewhere.
Yes, it would be, integrated in their same GIS system, so it looked ubiquitous.
So as we think, and Chairman Wheeler has called for that ultimately a national GIS system that ensures there are no seams in GIS across the nation would play a very positive role here. But
Agreed.
while we wait on something of that scale,
Right.
getting this agreement in adjacent jurisdictions would be very helpful.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, those are available to public safety. They just didn't, it really wasn't presented to them that way when they buy the systems. You know, they didn't think to say, oh, and I need to make sure I get, something beyond my boundaries.
Right. So much of this can be fixed without additional cost if the PSAPs are aware of this and work with their CAD and their GIS providers to say,
Well, I'm not
hey,
sure
I also
about-
want these other.
I'm not sure about the additional cost part, but
Well, that
I can't speak for them.
PSAPs are gonna trip up on that,
Well,
because none of them have spare cash lying around.
Right.
So we look forward to seeing the recommendations, but where there's a unaccounted for cost in PSAPs, we're definitely going to want to drill on that.
Okay.
Susan, just in terms of the PSAP handoffs, just one clarification, is warm handoffs from one PSAP to another the recommendation?
There is a recommendation in there to not do what we call cold transfers, which is just transfer it without speaking to the PSAP that you're transferring it to. So, yeah,
Thank you.
definitely. Okay. As I mentioned, we had our first call for Task 2, location-based routing, on Friday. We reviewed the task description and the key topics. And we agreed also that we needed representatives from key third-party commercial location providers, that they should be invited to these Task 2 calls. And so we're trying to identify who they are and get them an invite. The meetings are going to be held biweekly on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. Eastern. Potential obstacles, of course, is always time, since it's a volunteer effort. We have enough time from the work group members to complete the report by September, and the ability to get representation from some of these key stakeholders who will likely be a topic of the Task 2 report and directly impacted.
Susan, before you leave that, I just want to make sure that the larger group recognizes that we're really talking phase 1 routing here, right? So today, the first GPS fix that comes for phase 2 is in the order of 5 to 15 seconds. It's really not accurate until a second bid that comes about 30 to 35. So GPS today doesn't support the timelines. But as we go forward with next generation 911, we are going to need to have better accuracy than just near a cell tower. And so the question is, as we improve location accuracy broadly, then are we ready? How will we at some point shift from near a cell tower for that first route to what's my best estimate of the location of the phone against an underlying GIS database, which says, and now this is the PSAP that call should be routed to. Have I described the task right?
Yes, and we actually, in our call on Friday, we did identify 5 different sources of information that we could get quickly enough in order to do location-based routing.
Great.
Some are better than others, and that's our goal. Is we identified them, and then we're going to flush them out to see, what's the pros, what's the cons, and then which one seems to make the most sense.
And we're not talking an instant fix here, right? This is really something that we have a roadmap
Right.
for the future that may take
Correct.
years, but at least we'll be aiming towards something.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, last slide. Let's see. We had for task 2, we scheduled biweekly calls, and our draft is due August 27th, and the report is scheduled to be voted on September 14th. That's all I got.
That's great. Thank you.
Jeff, do you have anything to add?
I do not. Thank you, Susan, for covering it.
Okay.
Thank you, Susan, for that presentation. So before the council votes on any recommendation specifically for task 1, I wanted to see if any council members here in the room had a question for Susan or Jeff. You're not quite off yet, but you're getting close, Susan.
I was trying.
No questions in the room. Any council members on the phone have a question for Susan or Jeff? Okay, sounds like it's time to take a vote. There are no further questions. So I'd like to take a vote on Working Group 1, Task 1, the recommendations that we just heard in best practices and optimized PSAP reroutes. All those in favor, please say yay. Yay.
Yay. Yay.
Yay.
Yay. Yay.
All those opposed, please answer with a nay, either in the room or on the phone. Fantastic. Motion carries. It appears we have approval to move forward in those recommendations. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jeff.
Terrific.
We're getting things done here, Admiral, pretty quick. I remember when you kicked this off last year, so this is good.
It's an important thing. Thanks.
Working Group 2, Emergency Alerting Platforms, has a recommendation as well. So I think we have Farouk and Francisco. I'm not sure, Francisco, you'll be presenting. Farouk? Okay, fantastic. All yours. Working Group 2.
Thank you very much. I'm Farouk Katibi with Qualcomm, and Francisco Sanchez is the co-lead for the group, so I will make the presentation and Francisco would correct me. So, Working Group 2 has 2 sub-working groups. The first one is with respect to VIA security, and that's the one that we actually have a report out today for voting. And the concept is to understand what are the end-to-end security issues with VIA and how to mitigate them. The other task group in Working Group 2 is with respect to having alert across multiple platforms, and as well as additional information with respect to geo-targeting, etc., that I will go a little bit more detailed, and that came as a direction from Admiral Simpson. So we have 2 deliverables. The first deliverable with respect to VIA security is available now. The second one, recommendation with respect to one-to-many and many-to-one and geo-targeting, etc., will be available in September 2016. We have a large number of participants, members, and I would like to personally thank all the members who've been very valuable in supporting the progress of the work and enabling the completion of the, at least for now, the security sub-working group. Without their help and support and review and comments and discussion, the work would not have been able to complete in time. So thank you very much. So I will go briefly on activities of Working Group 2, alerting sub-working group, and then I will switch to the security sub-working group. So the alerting sub-working group is working on a number of activities, and this came as direction of Admiral Simpson to specifically add things like geo-targeting and make sure that we understand how to VIA system can be enhanced. In addition, we are looking at mass notification systems, social media, that was a subject that we discussed last time as well, many-to-one identifying barriers and solutions, potentially providing best practices, and generally improve public safety outcomes, which is obviously very important. We are doing actually several aspects, and we had a discussion. We had a great discussion even today with a number of with our FCC liaisons on what's the way forward with respect to alerting sub-working group. And one of the ideas is to promote VR usage through making sure that we have a very good geo-targeting. If you have a huge area and you send it and the people would receive a false alarm, the first thing they would do, they would disable it. So improve the geo-targeting, look into device-based solutions, and find out what is the definition of best practices. This is a term that's been used. What is the best approximate of the polygon that it receives? That needs to be more clarified, better defined, so that we can design a system that matches that requirement.
Francisco, on the device-based solution, I'm sorry.
Please, no.
That would be things like giving consumers the ability to select, for example, that they don't want to get Amber Alerts in the middle of the night, but they do want to get tornado alerts in the middle of the night, and to cache alerts that don't need instantaneous action for a later time. That would be an example of a device-based solution.
Correct. So that is also adding some consistency to that as well, because depending on your carrier or device, that's different a little bit. We saw some of those challenges actually in the flooding event recently in Louisiana and Texas, where those were some issues. Another device-based solutions we're looking at is how can we use device-based solutions to possibly improve the geo-targeting and geo-hashing. So while the spectrum of cell broadcast has limitations, so much computing availability is on your device right now. It already has mapping solutions. It already has images that are already incorporated into apps that you download. So looking at how we can use device-based solutions not only to address those issues that you discussed, but there is a lot of potential already there just if you look at what's already available on your phone.
The pre-staged content.
Correct.
Yeah. I just encourage the group not to think in the device-based solution category. It could be that the profile is held in the cloud, right? It may apply to multiple devices that a user may interoperate with. I think device-based is a good descriptor, but would hope that we're not constraining our technological thought process to just things that manifest themselves to a single device.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Thank you, Admiral Simpson. That's a great comment. Then next one also, that's what we discussed even last time, many-to-one, and also complementary alert strategies and social media. And I should point out that we had a number of great presentations that Francisco arranged that really highlighted some of the tools available out there to address this. So we will continue receiving this presentation and address these issues. And before I go to the security, last slide on the alert. So the plan is to continue with the presentations. And we discussed this morning, we're probably going to divide the group by focus areas only because there are potentially different interested parties in different areas. So we will probably divide the group by focus areas, and we will address the report, and we will have the report available by September 2016. Before I go to the security, let's see, Francisco, did you want to add anything?
No, I think we did a pretty good job of getting different partners and stakeholders that typically weren't at the table. Now, as Farouk has finished a substantial work on the security side, we're going to make a reassessment of who's currently on the group and consider whether, as this dialogue has continued, if the other partners and stakeholders that should be here, we did make initial invitations to folks like Apple and Google, and Twitter responded, but this would probably be a good time to do additional outreach back to those folks as the dialogue has gone in that way. We're going to try to expand the group and make it a little bit more diverse in that regard.
Great. Yeah, I think one of the there's so much good that will come for this, I'm sure. And one of the very significant things that could be done would be an end-to-end assessment of roles and responsibilities for cybersecurity in that chain of alerts and warnings, and how they go from the alert originator, but actually get to the individual at the end. Before, we just used to worry about that flow in the did they get it at the end, but now we worry about, can it be hijacked in the middle and changed? Can the resource be stolen and used by somebody else to broadcast in a way that would destroy public confidence in the system? And I don't think we've ever had a definitive description of roles and responsibilities end-to-end in the security tasks.
If I may, Admiral Simpson, I think you saw my next slide.
Thank you.
You're absolutely correct. I couldn't have presented it any better. So the next slide actually shows the end-to-end aspects of the VIA, and it starts from the alert originator to iPods, to CMSPs, to the carriers, and eventually to the end users. And what we did exactly on the security, exactly as you mentioned, we assessed what are the potential security issues that could be introduced at any point in this chain, and try to find what ways to mitigate it. So I go to the next slide. And the methodology that we use, precisely as you described it, is come up with scenarios, like somebody walk into the room and go to an alert originator and start typing a false alert, and kind of come up with a bunch of scenarios, and then find out what is the probability of that happening. If that happens, what's the risk, and what's the risk exposure, and how do we actually mitigate it? So that was the thought that we went through to analyze the end-to-end system of VIA. So based on what exactly you described on different scenarios, we came up with potentially 9 different risks. And this came across, I should point out that we had a number of great presentations, and Admiral Simpson suggested, for example, we have NIST, they gave us a very good presentation. So we had a lot of great presentation, and the members were very active, coming up with scenarios that some of them may be not necessarily, but we wanted to ensure that all the scenarios are considered. And some of them maybe was not very probable, but at least we wanted to describe them. So we came up with 9 potential risks that could present issues in VIA. None of them to the point that we would say, well, let's stop VIA, but definitely more work needs to be done to ensure that VIA is a very secure system. I'm not going to go to detail of all these 9 security, but we have detailed them in the report to a great extent.
Is there any significance to the order? Are they ranked order in greatest risk, least risk?
I'm afraid not.
Okay.
But that's a good question. I should have thought about it. No, they just as they came along, and we read the reports, and then we added it. Being the technical editor and the co-lead and everything else, I just added them as they came through. So
that's how to keep peace in the working group. I understand.
So what is our recommendation? After going through all these security risks and understanding it, we decided that we probably won't have enough time during this CSRIC to address all the risks completely. So our primary recommendation is for FCC to collaborate with industry, FEMA, DHS, and alert originators. And we ask ATIS to create this best practices document in collaboration with all these key players to address the security issues that we have identified. So, as I said, due to the lack of time, we couldn't have time to mitigate all the risks. But now that we have done a good portion of the work, we kindly ask the recommendation for FCC to collaborate with these key players to continue take the ball from here and create a best practices work so that we can address all this.
Okay, so, and specifically with ATIS, so
Yes.
For the FCC to perhaps start with a workshop with ATIS where we ensure that we're all baselined, and then have ATIS move out and work on that problem set.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know what's the best wording, but exactly what you said is that there needs to be at least a year more work of security aspects, and we need to make sure that all the key players are there. And I must admit that originally CMAS-VIA was done in ATIS with collaboration with the same group of people. So these group of people are very expert in the area, they understand it. So we want to make sure that the same group of expertise, now that we have identified that, yes, there are potential risks, how do we mitigate those? And we would like to have that best practices document completely published.
Are there other, in addition to the government stakeholders you described and the providers, are there other standards bodies that we should invite to the table that, even though ATIS would be primary, we would want to include
Very good question.
perhaps some cybersecurity, more cybersecurity-oriented standards bodies?
Absolutely. I think we should have it open to all the industry and standardization groups that are interested, and we should definitely, even TIA potentially should be included, and others that, for example, I didn't include it, but anybody, NIST and others who are expertise in the area, we should certainly welcome their input.
Yeah, because my specific thoughts are a standards group that is steeped in cryptographic methods to ensure that we're looking at an objective cryptographic standard that would give us the confidence that we'd be able to detect a corruption in the data stream.
Yes. So, Admiral, to be clear, I mean, the detection, as far as the encryption is concerned, is one method, but there are potentially other methods. I would just want to make sure that it doesn't come across that we are proposing that encryption shall be done. That was one scenario that we actually did review, but we identified what the risk is. Now, how to solve it is up to that larger group over the next year. And encryption may be one answer, but maybe there are other methods to make sure that the risk is mitigated.
Yeah, because I don't think we could ever distill this into a snapshot in time and say, do this and it'll be secure.
Absolutely.
Right? There's a thinking adversary on the other side of this that will continually evolve their methods. So while today we'd say, whoa, a cryptographic solution just would be too much cost for the gain we'd be looking for, we'd wake up 4 years from now and say, why didn't we start working on a cryptographic solution? So I'm inferring from your recommendation that not all the best practices would necessarily be applicable at the same point in time that we would work on setting forward a roadmap that would ensure that we're working best practices that are ahead of need in an anticipatory way with where the threat is going.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, you said it, as we get smarter, they get smarter, so we have to be always ahead of the curve. So the best practices will have the snapshot of what we have today. We make sure that all the security issues are mitigated, all the holes are covered, but that doesn't mean that tomorrow there's not going to be a new security potential. So we will address all the risks that we have identified today, but there may be actually even more risk, or there may be future risk. So absolutely, I agree. It's almost like a living document, if you will.
But what I would suggest is divide your product into best practices for the risk we know today.
Yes.
But then also identify any long lead elements where you feel that activity, either led by Addis or others, would be appropriate to ensure that 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we've done some of that long lead work, anticipating where we're fairly sure we know where the technology is going in some of these transmission technologies. What would be vulnerable a couple years from now?
We will definitely follow that.
Thank you.
So I have a few more slides on general recommendations that we have included. I'm not going to go due to the time. I don't want to take all the time of the meeting, but the report is very comprehensive, and it shows not only all the risk, but we actually have a lot more detailed of the recommendations. So with that, let me pause here, see if there are any additional questions.
Thank you, Farouk. So I'm going to look around the room here for tent cards. Any questions for Farouk or Francisco? We have a question? Yes?
It's Trey Fogarty with the 911 Association. I wanted to follow up on something the Admiral said, because you made a statement in your answer that I just want to expand slightly as a recommendation. When you start to look at the cryptographic aspect of this, we tend to hear the word cryptography and think necessarily encryption. Well, that gets people thinking about the privacy aspect of encryption. And I think for purposes of alerts, we're more concerned with authenticity and integrity. Those both rely on cryptographic primitives to accomplish, but it's not the same thing as encryption. So I think we need to be just a little bit careful about the language when we talk about this, and make sure that we explore the authenticity and integrity aspects of this fully, and sort of don't get wrapped up in the larger debate around the privacy aspects of it, because ultimately we don't care so much about privacy, otherwise it wouldn't be much of an alert. So I want to make sure that doesn't get lost, because I do think there are important things that can be accomplished there on the authenticity and integrity fronts that should be accomplished. And to the Admiral's point, the cryptographic aspects of that are very important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great clarification. Thank you, Trey. Other questions in the room? Okay, we're going to head to the phone. Any council members on the phone have any questions before we vote on this recommendation? Okay, so there isn't any further questions. I'm going to ask for a vote on Working Group 2. And I think their recommendation is a real focus on WEA security recommendation. All those on the council in the room or on the phone who are in favor, please say yay. Yay.
Yay.
Yay. Yay.
All those opposed, please say nay on the phone and in the room. Motion carries. Thank you very much to the council. Thank you, Farouk. Thank you, Francisco. Another piece of great work. Recommendation ratified. Thank you. We're going to move to Working Group 3, which is our emergency alert system. That also has a readout and a recommendation. So we have Steve Johnson to present, I believe, or Kelly Williams. Kelly Williams. Kelly.
Hello, everyone. Steve, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am, Kelly.
Excellent. Thank you. Steve is the co-chair of this group. And there we go. Okay. So I'm going to do a brief background, which is part of the template. Everybody has to see that every meeting. We'll do a status update of the entire group, because we have three project teams that are working right now. And then I'll jump into the security report, and we'll take some questions. So the group had, this is our description, we had 3 tasks that were assigned to us, looking at approving EAS security, examining multilingual alerting, and revising the EAS handbook. And specifically with those, For security, we were supposed to assess the awareness of EAS security, best practices that were adopted by CSRIC 4, and look at the barriers to implementing those best practices and create some recommendations to help incentivize implementing those best practices. In the multilingual, is somewhat a similar task, assess the state of multilingual alerting, and then make some recommendations on best way to deliver multilingual emergency communications. The handbook, there's an existing handbook. It's fairly dated, and we have to and have been working on drafting a new one for the Commission. Our deliverables in there, one today on security. We have 2 due in June of this year. Here are our members, and everyone's free to read through that list at your leisure. So where are we? We've completed the security work. The handbook work is actually coming along pretty well, and the EAS multilingual study is sort of underway, and we are confident we're going to hit our milestones for those as well. We've got going forward, we're going to keep working, having calls, so forth. The handbook group is chaired by Gary Tim. He is chair of the Wisconsin Emergency Communication Committee, and Jim Dubois, who is head of the Minnesota Association of Broadcasters, is leading the effort on multilingual. All right, so that was, let me catch up with the slides. There we go. So let's get to the security report. This project team was chaired by Gary Smith. Gary Smith is of Cherry Creek Radio. He is also a member of the full council, and hopefully he's on the phone too. I think he is. I heard him doing a roll call. So, Gary,
right here, Kelly.
Great. So hopefully you can chime in and answer some questions. I just want to give him a shout out. He did an excellent job in trying to sort of get this task off the ground. We had a very good group. It was mixed of all. We had EAS participants. We had some alert originators, had device manufacturers, and some of our government partners who were in there too. We had some fairly significant challenges starting in that it turns out that we really couldn't survey or actually do a study because of some FACA procedural restrictions on us. And we really had to try to find a way to meet these goals. And we worked with our staff liaison, Greg Cook, in looking at how to do that. We looked at the record of a public notice that was put out last year that didn't really garner a lot of information. I think that was part of one of our tasks, is try to help fulfill that record a little bit. But again, there wasn't there. And we really didn't have any alternative sources of data that we could really look at to assess where the industry was. One suggestion, for example, was that we encourage people to file comments in that public notice. It was still an open proceeding, if you will, but the time really did not allow us to do that. So what we sort of did was we essentially used the expertise of the group in front of us and sort of looking at some of these questions and trying to figure out what we could do. So let's jump right into the recommendations, and I'll talk a little bit about the rationale behind those recommendations as we go through them. So the first recommendation that's up, which is in big letters, and hopefully everybody can read it. I was trying to anticipate the size of these screens. So let me read this out. The information about how EAS participants have implemented security best practices should not be a matter of public record and should be held confidential. The Commission should work with other federal agencies to establish processes for sharing information that is considered by EAS participants to be sensitive and non-public. So this was based on what we sort of found was the biggest barrier sort of sharing information with the Commission and trying to understand what people have done with respect to cybersecurity. And that's just fundamentally companies don't want their cybersecurity information on a public record. This is a challenge that the Commission knows well, not just with EAS, but globally with cybersecurity. And this is something that they're working on. and they've made some proposals about how to sort of go forward with that. So this was a strong, kind of a strong message. Interestingly, it came both from participants and from manufacturers of equipment. So, but again, this is something the Commission knows a lot about, and they're actively working on in larger contexts. Second recommendation, EAS security recommended best practice should be readily available to EAS participants. CSRIC 5 recommends that best practice be prominently displayed on the FCC's website. And also, so as a corollary to that, is the Commission should do better outreach. So let me talk about a couple of those things. First, if you go to try to find the CSRIC 4 working group recommendations, you cannot find them. They are nowhere to be found on the Commission's website unless you know you are looking for CSRIC 4 Working Group 3 Report Number 1. If you Google, search EAS best, you can't find it. So that's one of the obvious recommendations. The second one really has to do with overall awareness, which is one of our questions, of the existence of the best practices themselves. And CSRIC 4 sort of did, the group that looked at this, CSRIC 4, did two documents. One was the recommendations themselves, but the other one was a document that said what the Commission should do to evangelize these best practices. And in the opinion of the group, the Commission really only did one thing, which was they issued a public notice asking people if they knew about it. Well, not a lot of people answered, and we feel there are a couple of reasons for that. So the second recommendation, or part of this, is the Commission should really go back and look at those recommendations that CSRIC 4 made on outreach and do a little bit more affirmative outreach. There was some outreach done by industry, like trade associations and so forth, but we feel that the Commission really didn't do its part, and that was sort of the sense of the group there. So the last recommendation, which has a couple of parts to it, I'll read it. The FCC should give maximum flexibility to EAS participants with respect to the differences between the best practices and the methods used to implement EAS security, especially where the methods used exceed the techniques established in the best practices. So the concept here is the best practices is kind of a baseline. And if I do something that's part of a larger cybersecurity or corporate cybersecurity or corporate resiliency program, if it's not exactly the same, if it doesn't match point by point what's in the best practices, a participant should not be penalized for that. That is, this gets to the concept, and this also comes from sort of the CSRIC framework, the NIST framework, which is, we're getting away from checklists. So we have these best practices. You take some efforts. You shouldn't be penalized if you don't do exactly what's in the best practices. And then there are a couple of corollaries to that, which really sort of focus on this idea of enforcement. And the first one is, if we share information, and I'm not reading this, but you share information with the FCC, if there's something in there, you shouldn't be subject to enforcement action because of something that you voluntarily give to the FCC. The second one is, in the event that you have a EAS breach, the participants shouldn't be subject to enforcement action, particularly if the methods that they used exceed or fulfill the intent of the techniques outlined in the best practices. So this comes back to another sort of cyber concept that it's not if you will be breached, it's when. And the issue is mitigating that risk and how do you recover from that. So those are the fundamental things. I felt compelled, unfortunately the captions were actually covering that. There we go. There it is. So in sort of the midst, so some of the recommendations we did, we wrote prior to a notice of proposed rulemaking that came out in January, particularly the first recommendation. So the group really feels that one of the first kind of question that we were asked to look at was somewhat superseded by issues in the NPRM. Particularly with respect, we were asked to say, how can you sort of evangelize this, best practices, and there are some specific proposals. So I just want to make that because it comes up. We highlighted that as a topic in the report, and it was there, so I wanted to bring it up. And that's it. So any questions?
Thank you, Kelly. Any questions or comments from anyone in the room?
Wow. All right.
So Kelly,
okay.
It sounds like what I'm hearing is that there's a recognized gap in that licensees aren't aware of the problem and the best practices. It sounds like something like an attestation that licensees have read the best practices, considered their risk, and taken reasonable steps to implement would be consistent with what you're recommending to us.
That's correct.
Yes.
Great. Thanks.
Yes. I think so.
Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. Any questions or comments from council members on the phone before we vote?
Yes. Hi, this is Allison Peacock with AT&T. I'd just like to thank and recognize the attention and diligence the members of Working Group 3 have provided to these tasks. I do believe it would be beneficial to the process if the FCC continues to prioritize the alignment of the initiatives and work activities to support a single outcome on a single issue in order to avoid rework and maximize our resources.
Okay, thank you for, I think that was a comment, correct?
Yes, just a comment.
Okay, I just was going to get someone to answer if it was more than a comment. Anybody else on the phone? Council members? Okay, so no further questions. We're prepared to take a vote. All those in favor of Working Group 3's recommendation today, please say yay in the room and on the phone. Yay.
Yay.
All those who are opposed, please say nay in the room or on the phone. Motion carries. Thank you very much, Kelly and Steve on the phone. Appreciate that. We're going to move to actually Working Group 6, Security by Design. That's where we have our next voting activity.
Hello. Oh, there we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Brian Scarpelli. I'm with the ACT, the App Association, and I'm one of the co-chairs of Working Group 6. Security by Design is our topic. My co-chair is, I believe, still on the phone, Joel Molinoff with CBS. Are you there, Joel?
Yes, I'm here, Brian.
Great. So, when you turn to our first slide, this is really just the objectives of the group. You'll find these in the scoping document on the website. We're tasked to develop recommendations and best practices to enhance the security of hardware and software in the core public communications network, and to also develop voluntary mechanisms to demonstrate success of the use of those. Today, we're presenting to you on the first bullet. So that, I guess our next slide sort of amplifies that. Little check mark there. That's what today is. Our goal is March 2016 for the security best practices and recommendations, and September of this year to turn to the voluntary attestations. Okay. So this is a depiction, basically, of our membership. We think it's a strong, diverse membership, a broad array of stakeholders, both public and private, that are impacted by own, operate, service, or otherwise the core communications network. We had, I think, very strong participation from all the different segments, if you want to call them that, of the communications, the core network. And I know the type's small, but our report also includes that table. You can take a look at it. So our next slide discusses the background. So as just from a higher level, as the CSRIC has moved into its current iteration, this advisory committee has proven itself to be a pretty collaborative and trustworthy example of a public-private partnership, and has been able to evolve to address emerging public safety issues faced by this sector. So, I'll mention it a few times, but as you can see in the slide, the previous CSRIC cycle's Working Group 4 final report, titled Cybersecurity Risk Management and Best Practices, has really provided a baseline for this, and I'll get into exactly how that is. Just should mention as well, that communications networks, organizations, efforts associated with security by design are, we consider them foundational to secure communications and also the larger ecosystem that faces increasing security threats. So to accomplish the goal, we initiated an open and accessible and consensus-based forum to address our tasks. And to the next. Okay, so this is an important image, I think, that we've. It's in our report as well, and again links back not only to the previous CSRIC's Working Group 4 report, but the 2012 National Security Risk Assessment. And what it is this is a graphic depiction from that NSRA of the core network. A little more on the scope. The report is intended to address best practices for service providers seeking to manage cybersecurity risks associated with technology obtained from third-party vendors, suppliers, and/or integrators for use in their core networks. And once again, back mentioning the Working Group 4 report, kind of showed that the NIST cybersecurity framework is a flexible and scalable document that we believe can be used to address security by design and utilizing a risk management approach. So we leveraged the NIST cybersecurity framework in our effort to provide our recommendations. Okay, so turning to our findings, there's a couple of slides, and you can see some images there that show some of the existing standards bodies, and that's a non-exclusive list, as is our appendix. But we did find that a diverse amount of information exists to help companies evaluate and manage cybersecurity risk and the development of cybersecurity by design principles today already. So we agreed that the communications sector should leverage these proven, industry-accepted reference materials and standards and best practices. And there's an appendix on our report, which is a non-exclusive list of some of those standards, which we sought input on from not only our working group, but the larger council. Okay. This is another finding we had. The point is that, given the diversity amongst all of the vendors and suppliers that serve the core network providers, that we wanted to keep our recommendations at a higher process level so that we could ensure applicability and flexibility to any and all who would like to consult this document. And we took this approach because we wanted the recommendations to be something rather than a snapshot in time of current technologies in the core network today, something that can be used moving forward. So we, as I mentioned, we were tasked with providing in this report recommendations to ensure the security of the core network and the supply chain that of it. We again use the NIST framework to complete an assessment. In fact, a mapping of the framework to security by design principles. And we determined that the most effective way to address the concerns that were brought to us and led to the formation of this group and this report would be in the form of voluntary recommendations and best practices designed to enhance the security of hardware and software in the core communications network. So building on all this stuff that I've said so far, we proceeded to take on a mapping exercise of security by design practices to the NIST cybersecurity framework, and our intention is that this would be used by sector members to understand measures to address security by design with their vendors and suppliers. Let's see here. So just another slide here. What we're saying here is that it's important for service providers to establish up front which party will be responsible for managing risks associated with the operation of the technology. And that answer can vary depending on whether the technology is delivered as a physical product or as a subscription-based service. And in a traditional product sales model, vendors could be expected to employ a secure development lifecycle that would include mechanisms for communicating information about how to mitigate or patch known vulnerabilities. However, some vendors would not typically be positioned to operate the technology or directly manage the risks associated with its operation. And so where providers, on the other hand, where providers have contracted for a vendor-managed service, the agreement very well may be that vendors or other operators of the service are required to assume compliance obligations for managing these risks on an ongoing basis. This is, I know it's very difficult to read for you sitting in the room, but this is a visual representation of that mapping exercise, and that's really kind of the center of the deliverable. It's a table which affiliates, and in some cases where it made sense, we combined categories of the NIST cybersecurity framework. You can see the colors there are affiliated with the colors used in the NIST framework, and we found a way that security by design fits into each of the major categories of the NIST framework. Another thing to note too is, while some people may still, I know that the NIST framework has been out for some time, and awareness is just an ongoing goal of it. While there might not be total familiarity with, for example, some of the subcategories referenced in that far right column, just want to note that the NIST itself has a very good website about the framework that has all kinds of resources and background and details regarding the framework that can be a helpful reference there. So recommendations. The first recommendation is that the communications sector members should use the best practices detailed in this report as a reference when they work with vendors or suppliers in order to reduce cybersecurity risk within the core network. We also discuss in the report that the voluntary approach embodied by the NIST cybersecurity framework, which incorporates the fully leveraging available technical approaches to securing the core network, and we offer details in that table. For example, notes some important measures such as encryption and authentication will drive future development of security by design standards and best practices, and that this approach will enable network stakeholders to keep pace with the ever-changing threats to the core network. We also have discussion in our recommendations around public-private partnerships and coordination and collaboration amongst all stakeholders impacted, and that using this construct, and CSRIC is a great example, is an approach that is encouraged and should be enabled in order to avoid inconsistencies in approaches to security by design and to increase intelligence sharing. There is, of course, another working group that is much more focused on information sharing, but that was something that we found important and raised in the report. And so those are the findings and recommendations. What this is a slide we've included in every deck that we've used. It's just it's like a timeline, so a visual representation of where we're at. I realize it might be hard for you to see if you're not looking at it on your own computer screen, but I animated check marks into the phases. So we talked about this previously in other ones, but we've used a three-phased approach to address the report, and we're going to repeat that for the next report. So this would be the final slide. It's just looking forward. The completion of this report and the recommendations in it is, in our view, an important step forward in securing the core network. But organizations should continue to advance their own security by design efforts to ensure that they're able to respond to the threats that are very dynamic. So we're going to continue our work on a future report with the due date being September of this year, or the goal, that will identify voluntary mechanisms that demonstrate the success of the recommendations and best practices in this report. And lastly, I would just say thank you to Joel, my co-chair, and all of the participants of the working group. Again, there was very strong participation, I thought, and good, a lot of input in the ideas and even the kind of the gritty, the drafting of the report, which was very encouraging, I thought. And lastly, to our liaisons, Emily Talaga and Stephen McKinnon. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. I'm looking around the room for council member questions for Brian or Joel, who's on the phone. Okay, I'm going to...
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, and to the whole group for taking on such an important task. The NIST Cybersecurity Risk Management Framework is a good blueprint for that top level of risk assessment that then guides you into lower level documents. But it really doesn't itself drill down on supply chain risk. That NIST document 800-161 does specifically go into supply chain risk. And I'm just wondering if the recommendation today includes that as a subordinate best practice piece, would be to use the applicable NIST supply chain best practice documents, not just the cybersecurity risk management framework, but NIST best practices for supply chain risk management.
Yes, it does. That's a good point to raise about the 800 series generally, but that document is very important, and it is included as a reference in our appendix. Okay. So, this report would endorse.
Related to that, increasingly CISOs are recognizing that they don't live in a vacuum. There's the CISO for a provider, but there's a CISO more and more times with vendors that would support providers, and as providers interconnect with other providers, there are CISOs there as well, and they're all in their own journey for implementing cybersecurity, and contracts are increasingly referring to contracts and other service level and operational level agreements are referring to
an attestation or a description by both parties as to what elements of cybersecurity they've implemented and where they're at, and there's a growing trend around shared security assessments. And if you look at entities that are not so large that they would fully implement the NIST cybersecurity framework, they may employ SOC 2 Plus or SOC 2 or security provisions that they would have to do in SSAE 16 and other kinds of risk processes. Did the group look at how company to company or provider to vendor, how a best practice to guide the assurance that both sides understand what to expect from the other with regard to their maturity around cybersecurity?
I think so. I think that was actually a very good description. I think that was a key component of when we kind of, we sat down for these extended meetings to undertake that mapping exercise. And that was a big component of that. But that probably also is an important piece of our next report, maybe, that's due in September. So that's very valuable to know.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks.
We have another question from Jeff.
Well, I just actually, Admiral covered most of what my points were.
Okay.
I just to further clarify and provide some perhaps anecdotal support for what the Admiral was just mentioning. One unintended consequence, perhaps, of contractually defining where the cybersecurity risk resides and having some of the best practices identified is that there may be an unintended transfer of risk as opposed to an important discussion of mutually agreed upon risk tolerances. And I can just say that as an organization who has been utilizing the cybersecurity framework as part of our operations now, one of our most valuable elements that has come from that is the dialogue with vendors to determine what our mutually acceptable risk tolerances are. And so while I commend the work of everything that this working group has done, I think it would be very important to at least emphasize, perhaps in the document, this importance of having that dialogue with vendors to reach mutually accepted risk tolerances, because that's really what the framework is designed to help identify.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Any questions from council members on the phone before we take a vote on the recommendations of Working Group 6? Okay, it doesn't sound like there's any more questions, so I'd like to take a vote on Working Group 6 recommendations, and these are best practices for hardware and software critical to the security of the core communications network. So all those in the room and on the phone in favor, please say yay. Yay.
Yay. Yay.
Yay.
The spirit is increasing. This is good. All those opposed in the room or on the phone, please say nay. Thank you. Motion carries. Brian, thank you for that report. It was fantastic. Thank you. We're going to move to Working Group 7, Cybersecurity Workforce, and Bill Boney is going to present to us.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Working Group 7, Cybersecurity Workforce. Let's go into the first one. Our overall working group description: leverage existing practices and to enhance the volume and quality of the workforce. We started off with a comment John made about the data points are pretty clear. There's a substantial gap in the current workforce, and this has significant consequences in the communications sector. So the deliverables for our group: examine and develop the recommendations for regarding actions the FCC can take to improve the security of the critical infrastructure through actions to enhance the skills, education, transparency, and best practices for recruiting, training, retention, and so forth. Next, demonstrate application of the National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework to the common and specialized work roles within the comm sector. Identify gaps or improvements in that same framework to evolve work roles or skill sets to be included in the sector members' workforce planning, and identify and recommend best practices implementation to deal with insider threats, as well as protecting the most critical elements of the communications infrastructure, and consider means to promote a common lexicon and roadmap that will promote more effective interface with the academic institutions and the other training environments, the supply side of that challenge we're facing. So the members of our work group are documented in this section. We've had some changes, relatively modest, but the folks that have been active very much appreciated, and they're thanked for their participation. Now, to reemphasize under background, we talk here data points, again, consistently over the last 3 or 4 years. It's been repeatedly documented that there just don't seem to be enough qualified candidates. You know, my own anecdotal experience out in Bellevue is we keep robbing from each other to get this talent we need for our current status, and that's not helping the overall problem get better. 35% of companies were unable to fill positions with qualified cybersecurity personnel in 2015. I think, and furthermore, less than half believe their current security personnel have the skills needed to deal with complex events. So it's not just an issue about quantity, it's also about quality and then maintaining that edge, how to make certain that the people that are in these critical roles have the skill sets as those develop and change over time. Okay, next. Now, workforce planning, this represents a generic planning process. It provides an overview that describes how you approach the developing of a workforce to be able to deal with emerging needs such as we see in cybersecurity. The next. So we focused largely in our work on, under phase 1, defining and identify the workforce, these subcategories of identifying the functional positions and roles, and specifically identifying and outlining competency, skills, and proficiency levels that would help the comms sector have the right kind of people in the right places to do the work that needs to be done. Now, we did, in order to accelerate the delivery of the content we've created, leverage work that was previously done by the Cybersecurity Workforce Alliance, CWA, to help us, because they had done a similar kind of exercise with the financial industry, particularly in the New York area. So we found that was very relevant and helped us move very quickly to creating a taxonomy that would allow us to document and communicate. So to the heart of today's discussion, let's see. We have completed an evaluation of the National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework. That's complete. And the conclusion was, yes, it's very relevant to our challenges, very helpful in providing a structured mechanism for communicating and identifying gaps and areas to focus. So we've delivered an interim report that both demonstrates the applicability of the National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework to the comm sector and also identifies specific skills and competencies that are appropriate and unique to the comm sector that should be included in that workforce. We've also created an electronic spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, that was also delivered to the Commission that would make utilization of this work product more accessible to HR and security practitioners throughout government as well as private sector members in the communications sector. This is, again, a depiction of how we got to where we got to. We started with that NCW from NICS as the baseline, and then we leveraged that data set that had been provided from the finance sector. We also then, working with the members of our work group, identified additional gaps in specific skill areas that were unique to the communications sector and folded that into the recommended data set, which is included in the report for today. To give you an idea of the scale of the work that was accomplished, again, at the comm sector, we ended up with 8 different categories, 29 specialty areas, 99 competencies, and 560 knowledge, skills, and abilities that we felt were relevant to. An example that we've used in other forums to discuss, well, what kind of stuff that was unique to the comm sector. Well, we've had multiple references today to the GIS systems and services. That wasn't a key element of the banking industry, nor of the original sector description that came out of NIST. So we've added those competencies and skills as far as the cybersecurity dimensions of that as part of the requirements. So our plans from here, we're going to segment our next phase and to capture the section-specific best practices and the challenges and opportunities in workforce development. The goal here is to try to provide some templates or some building blocks or some mechanisms that allow folks to take this massive work and say, so how do I use it in a private sector company like a T-Mobile? How might I use it in a state and local? How might I use it in a government agency to make sure that we've got the right kind of people doing the right kinds of work? When we talk about internal, those are folks that we have access to currently inside the team. Our focus on public safety and academia, particularly, is the supply side of that discussion. The externals, again, federal government, state governments, and financial sectors all have best practices that we think, some of which can be relevant, and we want to make sure that those are identified and packaged so that people can easily have access to that information and content. So the current timeline, March 2016, submitting the cybersecurity framework extensions for communications sector, and the interim report is complete. And our submission of the draft report on best practice and implementation recommendations is scheduled for December 2016. Now, we would expect to update the initial milestones that we've completed, and most of this work is going to be done in gathering and analyzing the data that lies ahead. So the final is to submit by March 2017 the full report on best practices, implementation recommendations, and tools such as we're able to develop in that time frame. So next steps within our work group, we are in the process of assigning ownership for each of the segments, so we have assigned members of our work group that are accountable for. So, for example, we have Dr. Endicott from the University of Washington on the academic side. Obviously, PhD, does a cybersecurity education training. She's a key person for that. There's several of us that are private sector members, so we'll be involved with, I'll be taking it to my HR VP, for example, and saying, hi, how are we going to use this here now? So I can provide real-world feedback from that, and other members of the team will be encouraged likewise. So we will continue our biweekly conference calls. We'll plan to have the final reports on the scheduled milestones with sector-specific data and have the content report finalized for delivery along with the quarterly status updates to the steering committee and council. So as I close out, I'd like to emphasize that in voting today, you're voting both for the written report that we provided and the electronic spreadsheet, which is it's the same content, but it's just in a different accessible format. But we want to be sure that the vote reflects the approval or the disapproval for that approach going forward.
That's great. Thank you, Bill. Looking around the room here for questions, comments from council members. Anyone? Yes. Oh, that was okay. Sorry, I thought you raised your hand. I'm sorry.
Sam, you had a lean that
a
looked
lean,
like you were
a lean into the mic. So sorry about that.
That's yours. Yeah, Bill, thanks. Excellent work by this group. Looking ahead to your next steps, it strikes me that as your group is working with industry and the subject matter experts within your group to identify and go into a greater degree of granularity around the needs of communications sector companies, and I presume you're going to have small, medium, large represented within that, that you're going to, near the next milestone, have a pretty good depiction of the need. It sounds like it might be useful for the FCC to think about a workshop that brings supply together with the need and draws upon academia. And I'll just give an example, and it's not because John Chance is to my left and is just wonderful, but they've done a wonderful thing with the University of Connecticut. And Comcast provides significant support to the program at the University of Connecticut, which has drilled down into an aspect of cybersecurity associated with hardware and the roots of trust within the communications ecosystem for how hardware can be trusted end to end. Great thing, but probably doesn't cover the full range of the full scope of work roles that you described. But I think, if you coupled UConn up with Carnegie Mellon, up with what MIT is working on, up with I was at Kansas University yesterday. They said something about rock, chalk, Jayhawk, but they're getting ready for a little March Madness. But they've done a lot of work on wireless, and they're drilling down on 5G cybersecurity. If we timed a workshop that brought some of academia in to talk about what they've done that might matrix well with what you've described in the way of the need, but even for them to learn about, well, are there unmet needs?
either in volume or in content that they can take back to their boards. Would that be a useful event if we timed that right?
I was saying one of the things that we've been doing as far as reach out is ACM actually has a curricular guideline working group. I'm sorry, and they represent. I'm sorry, I'm working on the work group as well. This ACM curricular guideline working group has been in process for about a year, and they've got another year and a half to where they get to where they're supposedly going to deliver guidelines. It represents multiple, I think there's a dozen universities plus membership, plus there's a lot like Intel and other folks like that in the industry. We've actually been engaging with them as well to see how we could, representing CSRIC and how the FCC could participate in a partnership in that. They actually are working on a workshop coming up here in the middle of the year, and we were actually going to reach out and say maybe there's a way that we can actually bring the FCC in, co-sponsor, or in some way, shape, or form participate. And that's going to bring in a lot of the other universities. GW, there's a professor here who's the chair of that group, very well respected in the industry in terms of cybersecurity education. So we were thinking that we were going down that exact path, I guess is my point, of how we could do that. But part of it is that since there are existing groups across academia that are consolidating and trying to drive this, to be able to partner with them is going to be a very positive way to accelerate the whole process.
Yeah, and expand the number of institutions that we're actually impacting. So we'll follow up on that, and I think your idea is right that we not reinvent uniquely an event when it'd be better to leverage another piece of this, activities that if we just co-sponsor or bring in a particular stream to an existing event, that we might be able to get more bang for the buck. But I think since you all represent prospective employers of their product, that bringing those two things together, the need and the supply, would be useful.
So, Admiral, thank you for your comment on that. I just wanted to add one thing where your offer to bring together the need and the supply. I think the university activity that we've seen has been one good supply of new talent coming through engineering and computer science programs. The other area that would be very interesting and has what we've seen as a very good supply is retired military. So to the degree that can be brought to the table in an organized way around supply, we have found that to be another good supply.
Just would caution that because I still have friends in DOD that when your salaries get too high, you don't always take the retired military, and that represents a retention problem within DOD. But point well taken, and anything we can do to help ensure a better match between supply and demand, I think would be useful here, given the significant national shortfall in this space. I spent a good chunk of yesterday at the APCO conference with public safety communicators, and they're all beginning to recognize that they all need cyber specialists as well. And they have very fixed operating budgets that are a real challenge at that, below the state, at the community level. So I don't think we can do enough in this space, I guess is my point.
Yep. Yeah. Any other comments or questions for Bill in the room? Oh, yes.
Trey Fogarty with NINA, the 911 Association. I want to build on, Admiral, what you and John both just said, and add one key point. As the working group and the commission think about putting together a workshop on this subject, academia, it's right and proper that academia should be there. They have an enormous role to play in dealing with this problem. And John, you're absolutely right. There's an enormous role for retired or recruited military admiral. But there's another piece that I really want to emphasize because it's one that should not get lost. There's a great deal of the cybersecurity professional community that does not come from and does not want to, and frankly does not need to come from academia. A 4-year degree is not a prerequisite to being a talented cybersecurity professional. And I was really struck earlier this year that the closing session at ShmooCon, which is a hacker conference here in D.C., was devoted to how cybersecurity professionals are going to be developed and trained over the next, decade or so. There was an enormous amount of interest, not in the academic aspect of it, but in the trade aspect of it. And I think that's something that absolutely has to be addressed in our efforts here if we're going to close the gap between the million or so open cybersecurity jobs and the number of professionals that we have to fill them. For our own part in the 911 field, we were struck 2 years ago at DEF CON by the number of in-house resources that 911 centers potentially had available but didn't know about. There are an enormous number of people in our industry who know something about computer security, information security. They have skills that they've developed on their own. They don't have a 4-year degree in the subject, but they're right there and in-house, and that's something that we're starting to wake up to and take advantage of. And I dare say that given the number of people who attend these types of conferences on their own dime often, we really have to work hard to look beyond, and when we have workshops like this, recruit beyond just the academic community if we're going to be effective with building a robust cyber workforce. Thank you.
Trey, excellent contribution. I couldn't agree with you more. Within the military, and John, you mentioned how valuable retired military are to companies that are addressing this need. Most of the experts are enlisted personnel that come right out of high school. And then we invest, or DoD invests significant dollars in not just initial education, continuing education, to ensure that their trades are developed, crafted, and then sustained. So I very much think that if we put this together, that there should be representatives from community colleges for 2-year programs, but also to experts that would help identify existing on-ramps for tradesmen, if you will, out of high school, and or where that isn't sufficient in capacity or quality, identification of the gap, and potential solutions to improve the on-ramp for tradesmen within cybersecurity to meet many of the needs that, if you look at all the work roles, there's some of these things that really fit well in that young person that doesn't necessarily want to go to college, but loves to muck around with computers and is pretty good with it, and given the right CBT and a couple of certification courses would be immensely useful to any range of communications companies or public safety entities.
That's great commentary. Thank you. Yes, Richard.
Yeah, I want to agree with Trey quite a bit on a lot of those things. I mean, I've been in the security community now for close to 30 years, and if you look at the breakdown of who's in it and who's not in it, and you look at who's entering it, you'll actually find a very low percent are coming from universities. And so when you start addressing this, just focusing on universities, I think, is minimalizing the problem, and you're not going to find your solution. Right? So I look at, how do they get to where they are? How are they growing themselves, or are they being taught within corporations? I mean, 30 years ago, you did security, you had to steal things to do security because no one believed in it. Right? You had to hack everything because nothing worked right.
And you had to wear a black shirt, or else no one really gave you any cred, Richard.
And there's some truth to that. I mean, I spent a lot of time going to conferences and meeting the new people. I mean, I did a talk recently in January at an organization, and I had a lot of the enlisted people basically come down and say, well, how did you get started? And try to explain to them, like, well, you can't use how I got here, right? How my path isn't going to work for you. But finding the path for them and trying to explain to them what path they can follow is sometimes difficult. You can say, well, the university has this, the university has that, but it's not going to get you down the path. It's not going to get you introduced into the community, right? And that's another portion as well. It's not just, do you have the education or not? Are you going to enter into kind of the social circles that will allow you to make that next level progression? Just going to ShmooCon is a piece of it, right? But there's 100 other little small things. What we call it, there's clubs, right? So there's the law enforcement club. Either you're in the club or you're not. There's the military club, the intelligence club. But the security community is its own club as well. And you have to consider those items in addition to just the educational piece. Because there's quite a few people in our community who don't have degrees or have history degrees, right? Or have a degree in God only knows what, right? There could be lawyers. Okay, there's probably not many lawyers there. But the idea is if you focus on just one small aspect of it, you're not going to solve the problem. And so I want to agree quite a bit with Trey, but expand it out with kind of the personal experience of starting at the beginning of these and kind of seeing where it is today. And even, like I said, even now, the people entering it really is an apprenticeship in many ways, right? When I'm interested in bringing someone in, and I find someone who has a particular skill set, and I bring them into the community, they're not there. They don't have everything I want, and I'm trying to train them and bring them up to the things that I want. It's not going to be university education that gets you there, though.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So we're really talking about a capacity challenge, an on-ramp that hasn't yet met that capacity challenge, and I think really exploring this area in a way where how can we either add more on-ramps or how can we get HR staff for companies more comfortable with the apprentice on-ramp for this. I think it's such a workshop, and we could take all day with this here and still wouldn't solve it. But all that would be immensely useful in such an event that would be timed for the completion of the next task, I would think.
And I would be happy to kind of talk about more of those things as well, because again, this is definitely something that I'm in the process of having to do all the time.
It's very encouraging to see the energy and enthusiasm around the table in this topic. Again, there are many dimensions. I want to be clear, though, that when we talk academic, we weren't just talking about university. It is not limited exclusively to that. And the non-traditional mechanisms, including apprenticeships, internships, and other mechanisms for cross-training and developing staff that have other aptitudes but have the capability and interest, remains part of the agenda. So very open to those inputs, and we'll make sure we accommodate that as well.
Before I get to Sam's question or comment, I think the spirit of the whole dialogue is this is a big problem, and it's growing, and we have to get creative. So the creative are all these different on-ramps, not just any one solution. Sam, now you do have your card up. Sorry that I called on you prematurely. I thought you might have a question.
No, I apologize for any false signals earlier. But I pretty much just wanted to echo the comments that were just made. I know that we in the broadcast industry are working to create that club, if you will, of folks, and we already have quite a few, especially of our larger companies, that are very committed to that and quite expert in it. But I think our ability to leverage those to include some of the smaller companies is going to be important. And so the more that can be done to have, whether it's a trade association or a club or that sort of approach, as opposed to just go to this university and take this core curriculum, the better we'll be.
My dad was a cameraman for NBC for 45 years, card-carrying member of the National Association of Broadcast Engineers and Technicians. His training was about 10 months here in D.C. at the Columbia School of Broadcasting. Yeah, we need that equivalent today in this cyber arena, right? It doesn't need to be 4 years. It can be a couple month-long thing, but we need the same kind of predictable product, I think, for many of these small stations that are going to hire one or two of folks to do this for them. And right now, just go into the local high school and asking kids who's interested in computers, they won't have the right mechanism in place, mentorship in place to develop appropriately that apprentice. So I endorse entirely what we're talking about here, but I do think there's something missing today.
So I'd like to go to the phone for any council members to be able to ask questions or make a comment before we vote on Working Group 7's recommendation. Okay, doesn't sound like there's any more questions, so I'd like to take a vote on Working Group 7's recommendation, which is a National Cybersecurity Workforce Framework to the communications sector and identified gaps. Remember, as Bill said, there are were two pieces of content distributed. One was in a PowerPoint format, one was in an Excel format. Ultimately, the content's the same. It's just a different consumption model. So all those in the room or on the phone in favor, please say yay.
Yay.
Yay. Yay.
We lost a little energy on that one, so but it is our last vote today. All those opposed, please. Thank you. That's better. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, all those in the room or on the phone opposed, please say nay. Would have been surprised. Thank you, everybody. Motion carries. Bill, thank you very much for that. So that concludes at least our 5 working groups that had recommendations today. As Jeff and the Admiral said in the beginning, I want to thank the chairs of these committees and their committees in general. When we started CSRIC 5, we came up with not only some aggressive and ambitious work groups and agendas, but we also laid down some requested timelines for deliverables so everything didn't stack up towards the end of CSRIC 5 later this year or next year. So I really applaud the work that came out of those groups and our ability to act on those and ratify the recommendations of those 5 working groups. So thank you. Now we're going to go back to working group updates, and we're going to start with working group 4A and work our way up through the remaining groups just to get an update, and then have some closing comments and close down the day. So we're moving to working group 4A, which is submarine cable resiliency, and it looks like Kent or Catherine is here with us, but Kent is going to give the update. Maybe with Catherine.
Thanks, John. And we will keep this very brief, as I don't think that there's anything newsworthy other than that we will be considering the coordination report at our June meeting. As I think some of you know, our biggest outstanding issue has been getting Army Corps participation in this process as they lead the key environmental review at the federal level for all new submarine cable projects. And as of mid-January, the Army Corps has joined our effort. They've been very responsive, provided a lot of information, and have allowed us to move forward. So that has delayed us from presenting that report and recommendations today, but we're not waiting until June to deliver it to the steering committee. It is going to be delivered by April 6th, and this is in particular to assist the Commission with an ongoing related rulemaking, which we don't want to hold up. So otherwise, we have some additional new participation, including Denise Coca, head of the Telecommunications and Analysis Division in the FCC's International Bureau, who has joined our effort as well. So things are very busy right now. I'm not sure if we have any other particular details that we need to add other than that we've started some initial scoping with our final report, which is focused on diversity of cable routes and cable landings. And we have an additional working group member, the president of a company called X-Site Modular, Amy Marks. That is a company that specializes in the development of modular cable landing stations for submarine cables. And so that's a company that's done a lot of thinking about diversity concerns and has proposed a very practical and cost-effective solution there. And so she's going to be a key component of that initiative as well. Anything further?
Any questions of Kent or Catherine before we move to the next working group update? I suppose we have a big thanks for the Army Corps of Engineers jumping in here in January. That'll help move the ball.
Hua.
And also a thanks to the Admiral and his staff for ensuring that we got Army Corps participation. That was an effort that took a lot more initiative and hours from Commission staff than it should have, but we're in good shape now.
Thank you, Kent, and the credit is due to my National Security Deputy, Deb Jordan, who really worked that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Then we'll move to Working Group 4B, which is an update on network timing. Jennifer Manor is our chair.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I apologize for not being there in person. We're making, I think, terrific progress, especially in anticipation of hopefully having as as good reports as were introduced and adopted today. In anticipation of that, if you go to slide 2, we have identified the problems that we're seeing that network timing, single source issues, and so we've identified a series of problems. As you'll see here, we've identified at least 6 solar flares or similar disturbances, space weather phenomena, RF interference episodes, failure of upstream time sources, whether deliberate or accidental, accidental or deliberate jamming, and spoofing. And after identifying the problems, we've also gone back and looked at the required characteristics we need to solve this problem. And at this point, we've identified 4 key characteristics: redundancy, independence from the radio navigation satellite systems, increased reliability, and the appropriate level of accuracy for the specific application, which is, of course, somewhat fact-specific. If you go to slide 3, we are now in our final work before we submit the report to CSRIC for review and approval. And we're looking at different options that are available. We've identified a series of options. I think we're up to about a dozen, and I've just included a few here just to wet everyone's lips for what's coming, whether it's eLORAN, use of MSS systems, commercial RF distributions, or others. And we'll have a fairly thorough analysis of the pros and cons of each.
Jennifer?
And we're looking not just at
Jennifer,
current...
we don't have your slides here readily viewable, so if you could just give us a sense of what you refer to in the slides.
Oh, sure. So I'm sorry. So on slide 3, those are some of the... We've identified about 12 options. We're still finalizing that for solutions for network timing backup solutions to GPS, and I actually only have a handful here. eLORAN, alternative RNSS systems, use of MSS, mobile satellite service systems, commercial RF distribution, sync over fiber, and then we have a number of others that we're just finalizing, and we're right now, and these are not limited to technologies that are here today. We also thought it was important to look at technologies that are just coming on board, and when we're going through in our future report in December, we'll, of course, that's one of the keys for our recommendations, but at this point we're just focused on the June meeting and identifying options. So we're putting together the pros and cons, and we'll have that ready for your consideration in June. So we're making great progress, and we very much look forward to the June meeting and being as successful as the groups who went before us and getting the report approved by CSRIC. So thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'll look around the room here. Let's see if there's anyone looking to ask a question on network timing, Working Group 4B. Anyone on the phone, questions or comments for Jennifer? Okay, thank you, Jennifer, for that update. We appreciate it. We're going to get an update now from Working Group 5, which is our Cybersecurity Information Sharing Working Group. There is a interim or draft report that very recently came out. We're not going to take a vote on that today, but we're going to get an update, and I think a lot of work has been put into this interim draft report, framing a lot of work that has been done in the future of where the work's heading. So I anticipate we'll have something to vote on in the near future, but everyone should take a look at that report even after the update today. So I'll turn it over to Working Group 5.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. I'm Chris Boyer with AT&T, and I'm one of the co-chairs of Working Group 5. So I'll give a quick readout as to where we are with the working group. And there should be a slide presentation that we can pop up here. Is there? There it goes. Okay. So the first slide on here, if we go to the next page, here's the clicker. Again, just kind of reiterating what we talked about in the last meeting, the description of the working group. So the main focus on the working group is developing recommendations to the council to encourage the sharing of cybersecurity information between companies in the sector itself. The next slide talks through the working group members. So if you go through that, this is just a list, a breakdown of who are members of it. And as you can see, we have quite a few folks that are participating in the working group. We probably have upwards of 50 people that are currently involved. And as far as the structure of the working group goes, we've broken it down into two different subgroups, one focusing on private-to-private information sharing and another group focusing on private-to-government and government-to-private sharing. So between those two groups itself, those entities are meeting. Both of them are meeting each once per week, so we have 2 meetings a week. And I would guess that there's probably 20 or so folks participating in each one of those separate individual working groups. In terms of the timeline, in December, we presented to the council an information sharing diagram, which I walked through in the December meeting for situational awareness purposes. And then the goal for this particular meeting in March was to take the diagram and build upon that to develop use cases around just providing examples of different types of information sharing that's going on in the industry. So that's the deliverable that we just completed. The documents that have been provided to the council are basically a summary of the use cases that we've developed thus far. The next step then will be to take the use cases that we've developed and determine what are some impediments or barriers to information sharing. As you read through the use cases, you'll see that we already have kind of a head start on that. There's been discussion in each one of the individual use cases of what some of the barriers are. And then following that, we will in December look at different types of sharing platforms and then conclude in March of 2017 with recommendations for how to improve sector information sharing. So what you have in front of you is basically a first draft of what will ultimately turn into the final report in March of 2017. Again, the use cases will serve as a baseline for us to develop the barriers and then additional recommendations. So I view this as an iterative document where we'll be continually refining it as we go forward. And in terms of the use cases, there are presently 4 different use cases by category, which I'll discuss in a second, for private to private. There are 10 use cases today for government to private and private to government. I talked earlier today with Joe Vines, who's with Time Warner Cable and is the chair of subgroup number 2, is focusing on the government to private sharing. And we may have a couple of additional use cases that come in after the fact, but just something to be aware of that could be added. So moving forward, the next slide goes through the diagrams. This is what I presented last time. And if you look at this picture, I won't walk through all the details again, but if you look at the picture, the left-hand side of the diagram is really getting at private-to-private information sharing. So it's focusing on things like sharing network threat indicators or threats to the network itself with our peers in the industry. So things like a group that we call the Network Service Providers Group that meets on Mondays that includes some of the major carriers, informal or formal peer organizations, commercial partners, third-party providers, and the like. So the left half of the diagram is focused on kind of trusted peers and commercial partners, and then kind of what we do in our own internal networks for our customers and ourselves to deal with security. And then the right hand of the diagram is kind of the government side of that, which is sharing through the DHS process and through the NCIC. And so when you look at this picture, you can kind of break it down into 2 separate groups, which is how we came up with the subgroups of the private-to-private piece and the government-to-private piece. So based upon we wanted to do the diagram first to kind of get a picture of how is the industry sharing today, and then that would help us organize our work going forward, and that's where we came up with the 2 subgroups that have been meeting thus far.
Chris,
yes.
Just helping me orient to the document, the center has ISP. Would there be another one of these for broadcast, or is broadcast represented in the trusted peers and commercial partners given their convergence in their connections to ISPs now?
I think you could put just about anybody in that box effectively, and because if a broadcaster had a cyber threat that came in and they were a member of the sector and wanted to share with like the NCIC or any of these partners, they could potentially be there. We just used ISP as a label for that, but we should probably relabel it to make it more accurate.
It would be helpful because at the end of the day, we want this to influence 30,000 entities that make up the communication sector, and if the recommendations are intended to follow the CSRIC 4, Working Group 4, binning of 5 different communication sectors, then that would be helpful to know if there's a different binning based on, well, let's anchor this around ISPs because it's all IP now.
that might be an alternative way to do it, but I think for everyone else to follow along, it'd be useful to for us to know which of those two or something different.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and we can figure out how to fit each one of the segments in the sector into the diagram somehow. Because I think a broadcaster could fit in multiple boxes, or other members. Like they could be a customer, right?
Right.
They could also be an entity that's doing sharing of itself because they monitor their own network. So depending upon where you are in the flow, they could fit in different locations. I think same thing would apply for satellite and mobile operators as well. So we could take that back as an action item for the working group and amend the diagram to kind of reflect that, I think.
So just maybe following on to that comment, I mean, this is a private-to-private representation. I think it's a use case that focuses on the ISP or the provider.
Right.
There might, in addition to this one, I think this is a great one, but there's probably some other cuts of this same coordination, whether it's public-to-private or public-to-public. I mean, and in this case, since it's sort of a focus on the ISP, they play a significant role. It's here. There might be a couple of other cuts with all these different flows to show coordination, and this is a good example of one of them. So I just encourage the work group to think about those other coordinated efforts across different entities here.
Yep.
An example being iPause to broadcast, which is a specific use case, but doesn't go through necessarily an ISP.
Right.
Yeah.
Correct. Right. So we can take that back as a follow-up item, and I'll add that to our timeline to make some amendments to the diagram to kind of reflect the full picture of the industry.
One other comment on your diagram. In parallel with this, the public safety community is working hard on an objective security operations center for PSAPs, and it looks like the developing consensus is that there be shared security services at some degree of aggregation, either at the state level or maybe a couple within a state, supporting multiple PSAPs. And they've titled that objective model EC3, Emergency Services IP Network Cybersecurity Centers. And it would be useful, given the very important relationship for 911 and next generation 911 between the communication sector and that specific entity for whatever framework you ultimately vote out to reflect public safety's most current objective security operations center model.
Okay. Yeah, I think those are all good points. So we can certainly take that back within the working group and amend the pictures so that we show. And I think the goal here was not to kind of present the ISP as kind of the center of the universe, but really to show how there is how if you were a provider today, how you might share and what the different constructs are and what the different mechanisms are. But we could certainly figure out a way to represent that for other members of the sector as well. And in some cases, you have entities like my own who fall into multiple of these buckets as well. So.
Yeah, I think it's a very illuminating chart. And Chris, I think your point about the ISP isn't always the center of it is there's probably a couple of different versions of this that illuminates all those contact points for lots of stuff. So.
Yep, agreed. So I appreciate the comments, Admiral, and we will certainly take that back to the group. So kind of moving forward now into the use cases. So the first one is the private-to-private case. And in this situation, there was kind of a general decision made within the working group that we didn't want to call out particular examples of sharing or particular groups as being the best models because of the fact that some of them are vendors or business partners, and we didn't want to be viewed as being biased in a particular direction or another. So what we tried to do is structure it into different types of relationships and different types of data. And so the way it was looked at was on the relationship side, you have different types. The relationships could fall into two different main buckets. One would be like a formal relationship, so where you have a contractor or you're vetting different groups. So so there's a group, or there's an official process that you have to go through to become a member of the group, and there's a full vetting that's done. It's a little bit more of a formal relationship. And then there's also informal type of relationships in the information sharing space. So these are things like just personal relationships, open source sites. You have things like listservs that are out there to share information. So it could fall into the category of either formal or informal relationships. And then in terms of the data, you have structured data. So this is very specific things like data feeds, anti-spam feeds, antivirus, machine readable information. And then you have just kind of unstructured data. So these could be things like making a phone call, sending somebody an email, a presentation, or those types of things. So structured data is the kind of data that fits better with the kind of real-time information sharing methodology that we've talked about a lot with DHS. But the unstructured piece is something you want to encourage, but that's really like pick up the phone, call somebody, and tell them I've got something going on type of scenario. So we broke it down into those 4 buckets between the formality of the relationship and the structure of the data. And then what the next slide does is it basically puts together a chart that kind of provides examples of organizations or types of organizations that fall into each one of these 4 quadrants. So you could have a group that's kind of based upon a formal structure but is sharing kind of unstructured data. And some examples of that are the network service provider group that we talked about earlier, a group like Ops Trust, groups like MOG, some of the other sector ISEX, Oasis. And then you have kind of the formal structured data, so a formal relationship with very structured data. That could include things like commercial products that do anti-spam, anti-phishing, threat intelligence, and those types of things. And then you have in the bottom quadrant kind of the informal, unstructured data. So these are more personal relationship based. Could be things like InfraGard or Nanog and other groups that we're dealing with now. And then you have kind of the informal structured data, which is kind of the more open source, not commercial products, not for sale products that also get into areas like anti-spam, anti-phishing, and threat intelligence. So we tried to break it down into each one of these 4 quadrants as examples of types of information sharing that are going on. And then the next slide is an example of a use case. So what we did is we did a use case for each one of the 4 quadrants. And the format here is a breakdown of what the use case looks like. So what we tried to do in each use case was talk about what is the relationship, who is the information being shared with, what is the type of content and the value of the relationship, the timeliness, and what's the process, and then list off some of the benefits and gaps, and then barriers and challenges. And as I said before, that will help us. That would be informative for the next phase of the report where we get into the barriers and challenges and recommendations. But we did a use case for each one of the 4 quadrants. I just put one in here for now, just in the full document, obviously all 4 use cases are there, but for the purposes of the presentation, I just put one in as an example. And then we did the same thing for private to government to private. I put them both because it could be from private to government or government to private. In that case, we did 10 different use cases. This is a list of what they are. I'm not going to go read this to you. I'm assuming everybody can read through this, but some examples are an EAS disruption, the data breach report, the Heartbleed virus, social engineering attacks, hacktivist threats. But we basically looked at each one of those 10. We worked very closely with John O'Connor, who works over at the NKIC with DHS. And they worked closely with Joe Vines, who's chairing the comms ISAC at the moment, and worked really closely together to pull this list together because this obviously involves the NKIC in an extensive way. And again, we did the same thing here of putting together a use case for each one of the 10. Again, with the description, what's the type of relationship? So again, formal, structured in a lot of these cases. Who it's shared with, the content value, timeliness, and the sharing process. And again, the benefits and the barriers. So the goal was we have 10 individual use cases for those. As well. So there's one of these charts for each use case. And again, the draft, the iterative, I guess we call it an interim report, but that reflects all 10 of the use cases. So it's about a 20-page document at the moment.
Maybe it's in one of the other group of use cases, but ransomware is an increasingly bothersome category that it seems to be for just a little bit of Bitcoin. There's a range of threat actors that could wreak havoc, are wreaking havoc on smaller companies, potentially smaller providers in the future. Is that a captured use case, or is that something you could add? I'll
have to check. I know Joe's listening to the call, so I'll have to come back and check with him. But it could be something we could certainly look at. I would think. I don't think there's any reason not to. So.
Okay. Maybe there's somebody either in the room or on the phone from the committee. I would expect that to be a flavor of malware, but maybe they're thinking about it differently.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I think it's more than just a flavor of malware. If you look at the full from threat intelligence, what organizations would
be interested in tackling what kinds of companies. There's and then attribution versus how do you pay, how do you make it go away in other ways. Best practices in how you'd recover from that, or how you'd restore and get some degree of operations back up on the line. I just think there's a range of things, in particular as I look at the smaller providers, small broadcasters in particular, where they want to make sure that ransomware is going to keep them from being on the air with content. Because of the increased prevalence of ransomware going after small organizations, I think it would be prudent to have the group look at that, given the large number of entities in the communications sector that are in that small business category.
I think in this case, it's the use cases are focused on information sharing, so we can certainly look at what type of information could be shared that would be beneficial to individuals that are dealing with some of these types of attacks.
Well, and then how they would share the information.
Yeah.
So if they've got a structured way of saying, hey, you just had CryptoLocker take over your system, what should they be ready to provide? Their logs, their last backup, a backup from a year ago? What information sharing in a buy-the-drink information sharing would groups like that need to be ready to provide?
Or what would be useful for the rest of the community, I guess.
Right, for a group then that's going to come in and help them restore and recover.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of the challenges that we have with some of these issues is that we try to write the use cases in the report in a way so we can make some recommendations on how to deal with things, and people don't want to get too down in the specifics of that, because obviously if you're a victim of some of those attacks, it's always a challenge in getting people to come out and say, well, I was hit with this and here's exactly what happened, and that might be a commercial product type of an arrangement.
It's just a different category. It's a after the fact information sharing,
right,
for those companies of 4 or 5 employees that just aren't going to get into the kind of 24/7 by 365 machine-to-machine information sharing that hopefully is the objective of many of the larger companies.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And then, for the sake of time, I will go to the.
Chris, we have a question to comment.
Oh, sorry.
Richard.
Comment on the Admiral's thing about ransomware. I think it'll probably be a very bad example to use. Because once you kind of have it, you're kind of screwed. There's not really much information sharing at that point. I mean, I'm working with a lot of organizations now, and the way that we combat ransomware more is getting the malware, reverse engineering it, finding the keys, and then making the keys available. I mean, then the hard part is actually just identifying the victims, right? So there's so many different types of ransomware. It's there's 10 web pages, and any one of them will give you a tool to decrypt your whatever you have. However, you have to know which one of the many versions you may have to know which one to download. So I think we have to be careful about some of the case studies and make sure they're actually going to be usable for what we want to describe here. And I think ransomware might be one we may want to stay away from. I mean, and ransomware is a good one for maybe here's things you might be able to do, but once you have it, there's not much chance of information sharing.
Yeah, I think you're missing my point. And I think most of the time should be spent on information sharing that allows a predictive, proactive action by a company to reduce the likelihood that they'll be compromised. But unfortunately, there will continue to be a range of companies that aren't ready to be left to boom yet, that will need some kind of guidance on the information sharing in the respond and recover part of the risk categories, so that while they can't take all the steps necessarily to prevent it, can they improve their readiness to share information once they've been compromised in a way where they can more quickly come back online?
Yes, But again, I think ransomware puts it in by mentioning it specifically, I think it's a very specific category that's more difficult to do some of those things. I mean, I think in generalizing, there was an attack, there needs to be a recovery, and dealing with that, I think, is absolutely true. But certain specific types of attacks, I mean, I think there's...
It's just a use case. It's just illustrative of that. You can't always be to the left of boom. Sometimes you're to the right of boom, and there's information sharing that is useful then as well in the respond and recover.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen this particular case. I mean, I think an educational role is much more important. If this happens to you, these are the things you might want to do. But when a corporation has it, there's not much they can tell you besides it got in somehow. You know, a doctor was looking at Facebook or CNN, and I got it via an ad chain, and it affected the medical machine that we were utilizing, right? So I just worry about having something, because that very specific one has certain ramifications and paths that are more difficult, I think, that would make this more complex for this working group to deal with.
Yeah, I think Richard makes a good point, and I think maybe we take this conversation back into the working group and see if there's a way to address the Admiral's point, and in some fashion, but not disrupt the ongoing progress. And I think the other thing to think about.
Hospital in Los Angeles didn't even know what ransomware was. Wake up one day and what do we do? And there are 20,000 plus entities within this sector that are in the same position that hospital was.
And the hospital one is a great one because that was so they didn't use, what was it, working group 7, that the lacking of the not sufficient cybersecurity force, right? They were you're going to allow doctors to use Facebook and Instagram and other things from the operating room floor, right? Utilizing medical gear that at the same time is doing prescriptions and maybe looking at the results of an x-ray, I can also do Facebook on. Are fundamental things that you probably, that's an educational thing, right? And having the security people to go, that's really a bad idea. Here, give the doctor an iPad, go do whatever you want on it, but on this machine, don't really go to your Facebook page.
You can't fix stupid.
Okay, that's a good one to take it to the work group on.
All right. So with that,
there is probably some work there, and I think there's enough people as part of the work group that are here. Is there some way to address that? I think it's how do we deal with the smalls, the bigs, and everybody in the most effective way. Yeah,
and we've even had conversations in the working group to recognize that not everybody's created equal when it comes to capabilities, right? So, when we start getting into, and I've had the same thing come up in the DHS ISO meetings I've been participating in, that when you start talking about turning up like sticks and taxi servers and doing automated sharing and threat indicators, that there's a range of entities. There's a, how would you say, a maturity model around some entities are way more upscale on that maturity model versus others, and how do we make sure that whatever recommendations we come up with aren't leaving behind people that may not have that. So I think that's recognized as an issue that we've talked about. In terms of next steps, the next thing, next phase is to look at the barriers and challenges. We have a couple of follow-up items from today, I think, with the diagram and addressing some of the use cases, but that we should have time to do that in addition to going through the barriers and challenges, because we have a bit of a jump start because we've already identified them as part of during the use case process. And we'll be looking to do another face-to-face meeting within the working group in the second quarter. We had one of those in early February, so we'll probably be shooting for sometime in May, June timeframe. And then in June, we'll be putting out another interim report that will reflect kind of the barriers and challenges that we learned from the different case studies, and again, continuing to provide updates for the council. And like I said, I expect this document that we've shared thus far, it's starting to create the form of what the final report will look like. We will be continually updating it, but the use cases will be included in, or the case studies will be included in the final report. And just one last comment on those is that they're not really intended to be all-encompassing, right? So if there's scenarios that we didn't cover, it's not because of, that they weren't talked about. It's just we were trying to come up with enough examples so that we could form a good baseline of what is the industry doing now, so that when we go to the barriers and the recommendations phase, we have something to look at and say, well, here's the use cases that we did, and here's the challenges that we saw. Here's how we can make things better. And that was the real goal of the case study. So there might be things in here that, like to the example of ransomware and those types of things that are not covered right now, not for any particular reason, just because we wanted to come up with one. We asked the members to submit what they thought were good use cases for the baseline.
Yeah, and I acknowledge that it may the feedback to us might be that would be distracting for us. Work that in another area, and that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So with that, that's Working Group 5.
Chris, thank you. That's a very thoughtful way to organize a complex matter, and then an awful lot of work into your interim report with the work group around the use cases. So thank you. I'm going to look around the room for any questions or comments from council members for Working Group 5. Anybody on the phone, council member who has a question or a comment for Chris in this working group? Thank you, Chris. Thank you to that working group. We're going to move to our final working group update today, which is Working Group 8, Priority Services. The council members will recall that this is one that we got a little bit of a late start on in terms of finding our chairs and getting our committee together and the charter of the committee. But this is the first progress report from Priority Services Working Group 8.
Thanks. It's on? Okay. Bill Reedway from New Star, one of the co-chairs of Working Group 8, joined by my co-chair Tom Anderson from Cisco. Happy to be here for our first substantive update. Also happy to be in the prime spot, standing between the council and what's sure to be a very memorable trip out of Washington today. I'm glad to hear there's a Working Group 9. So that next time it'll be them that's in that spot. But as I say, this is the first time that we actually have a substantive update for the group. We had our first introduction back in December. The charter for Working Group 8 is to address the evolution of priority services in an environment that is trending almost exclusively towards packet-based technologies. The charter includes both addressing the challenges of IP networks in terms of resiliency under congestion and security, but also addressing the opportunities, potential benefits of flexibility in the user experience. I'll take you through the course of the presentation today what we have been doing with ourselves over the last 4 months. We started out early this year with a briefing from Admiral Simpson in terms of guidance on our scope and direction. The counsel that we took away from that was to take a clean slate approach toward this. There's obviously a lot of work that's going on with respect to priority services in other fora. Individual service providers are focused on preserving existing capabilities in next-generation networks, including LTE and others. The Office of Emergency Communications is in constant assessment of the needs of the user community and what next-generation network can do for them. And then, of course, we also have ongoing planned deployment of dedicated networks like FirstNet. The counsel that we took away from our discussion with the Admiral was to survey the landscape with all this ongoing work, identify gaps that could potentially persist, both in terms of technology and also policy, and attempt to future-proof the Commission's recommendations and plans, given all this ongoing change. So that's what we did. This is our membership, which has been largely stable since we began. I'll take this opportunity on behalf of Tom and myself to thank everybody for the work that's been done to date. We focused on three things since we kicked off. The first is really just establishing the right cadence and pace necessary to meet our aggressive deliverables, since we did get a bit of a late start. The second was establishing all the vectors of communication that we would need as a group to gather the information that was required in order to create an informed and educated set of recommendations. And the third was to define a framework for our deliverables and define the problem statement, use case, scope, whatever you want to call it. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. In terms of status, and this is a bit illegible from this distance, but I can tell you that the working group meets and has met every other Friday, 1 o'clock p.m. We'll continue to do that for as long as our charter persists. We've also had a number of special sessions since December. I mentioned the one with the Admiral. We also got a formal briefing from the OEC on current state and future state. We just a couple days ago sat with working group chairs of the Next Generation Internet Working Group from the TAC to talk about how what they're doing with QoS and QoE can inform the framework for priority services. And we have upcoming in May, our first briefing in the other direction. We'll be visiting the OEC user community to talk to them about what CSRIC is trying to do and what our objectives are. And we expect to learn a lot from that discussion as well. We do plan, I should say, we had on the list to have a collaboration with FirstNet. Given some of the ongoing sensitivities with the ongoing contract process there, that's still an open item, but it's still something I think that's important to the group, that we share our works in progress and make sure that we're collaborating appropriately. Our schedule hasn't changed from the last time we met. We set an internal deliverable for ourselves to set kind of a concrete framework and definition of what our problem statement is by the end of the quarter. That's on track. I'll talk a little bit about that before the presentation closes. We believe right now that we've got enough content potentially for 2 reports. So we've basically split our drafting up into 2 series of deliverables, Report 1 and Report 2, which will complete, as is listed on the slide here, December and March of next year. And opportunities that we have to accelerate that as we narrow our scope will obviously take. So with that, I'll close with a little bit of discussion with how we have gotten to this point in terms of defining what our problem statement is. We've defined a framework that exists in 3 levels at the moment: a network framework, a user framework, an application framework. So each of the individual problems and use cases that we've identified falls into one of these different layers. It helps us to organize the content of the report and divvy up some of the work and the research. The first, from a network perspective, we have assumed that one of the primary challenges that has to be resolved is the issue of hybrid environments. We expect that every priority communication in the future is going to traverse some combination of managed and unmanaged networks, some combination of public and private networks, potentially some combination of domestic and international networks, and identifying potential weak links and gaps in quality of service, resiliency, security is one of the things that we're focusing our attention on. That would then lead us to the user framework. Primary challenges here are associated with authentication and authorization. How is it that a user is going to identify themselves and prove that they are who they say they are in order to get access granted to the network, to the service, I should say, and then what rights, roles, and responsibilities do they have once they get there? One of the things that we've found is that out in the community there are several priority schemas, priority hierarchies that are being used inside a number of these initiatives. If you're assuming a hybrid environment from a network point of view, these priority schemas need to be able to talk to each other. The presumption is that capacity is not going to be unlimited. There are going to have to be choices made in terms of who gets priority in a congested environment, and those different priority schemas and hierarchies have to be able to talk to each other in order to make that successful. The other thing that we've included in here is sort of offline topics like provisioning and education. Last thing we want to have happen is have all this great infrastructure in place, but then when an incident happens, people don't know how to use it, or they're not made aware of what their status is during the time of an incident. So we've got that covered as well. And then finally, under this layer, we're also looking at some projections of what the user community looks like down the road. CSRIC 2 actually had a working group looking at priority services specific to a pandemic situation. There were some projections made about what the user community would look like a couple years down the road. We are a couple years down the road, so we want to assess that and update it.
Please, as you do that, think about FirstNet as well.
Yeah.
Right. Do you want this to influence FirstNet, or do you want FirstNet's prioritization schema just to be something you got to be backwards compatible with?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that we very much wanted to speak with some folks about. We're going to have to figure out how best to determine that hierarchy, that back and forth, given some of the sensitivities that we've been presenting. Okay. So that leads us finally to the application framework. We're assuming kind of a multimedia approach from the ground up here. The presumption is that once a user is authenticated to a priority service, they could potentially be going back and forth between voice, video, text services, things that have to persist in real time, and others that just kind of look that way from for example, messaging, social media, etc. So you can imagine priority being assessed on an application level as well as a user level, and we want to take that into account as well. We also want to take into account the probability that a particular communication is not necessarily person to person, could be person to machine, could be machine to machine, and how those kinds of decisions are made and scarce bandwidth is allocated is something that we want to make sure that the Commission is informed on. So this is, as I say, this is more of a problem statement than a set of solutions right now. That's kind of where we want it to be as we got kicked off. I think as we continue our research and analysis, you're more likely to see this narrow than expand, which we think is probably a good place for us to be. But as I say, we have left ourselves some capacity to split the work into multiple reports as we identify which areas of this are well understood and don't really require a whole lot more from us, and where the working group can provide some unique insight and analysis. So that's. So I mentioned, where we're at from here. We're set to close our use case section by the end of this month. First draft report is currently set for June 30th, and we'll continue to provide periodic updates to the council.
Thank you, Bill. I think fantastic organizing principles around a very complex matter. So I like the way that was laid out. It's very easy to understand. Any questions, comments from council members in the room on the update from Working Group 8, Priority Services? Admiral Simpson.
Yeah, great presentation, and this is a really difficult task, but one that's so important to the nation as we go forward. And I also echo the compliment on your organization for this. I just would offer that a lot of times there's things that you all in the communications sector can learn from each other. I received a brief 2 weeks ago from America's public television stations, APTS, and they are doing some really innovative work with regard to squeezing into broadcast using ATSC 3.0 data casting in addition to their channel content. And they have now, working in a prototype, the ability for communities, for broadcasters to shrink down the quality associated with channels during periods of time when the community would need and benefit from a greater data casting throughput in response to an emergency, that kind of dial a throughput for what's the greatest priority. I think while it might not be specifically applicable in the technical way they've implemented it, the governance and the organizational structures around how and when to degrade the broadcast channel to support community data casting would be useful for this group.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. I've got the note to bring that back to the working group. We did talk about this notion of a graceful degradation on a per application basis, depending upon the needs of the particular incident and what kind of sophistication you'd have to have at each of the levels of the framework in order to do that well. So good note. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from council members on the phone today?
Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much. Tom, thank you. Before we conclude our closing remarks, I know Admiral Simpson wanted to spend a little more time on the new working group that was announced at the beginning of our meeting, Working Group 9, to provide a little more definition on the charter of that group. So, Admiral.
Great, and hopefully generate some interest in chairs and co-chairs. Working Group 9 will focus on promoting security in networks and devices using Wi-Fi spectrum. Currently, enterprises utilizing Wi-Fi spectrum rely on numerous methods to secure their networks and connected devices from malicious attacks.
Working Group 9 will identify for CSRIC consideration when and under what circumstances the use of a variety of advanced security measures are appropriate. Specifically, what we're looking for from the group is identification of the threats most consistently facing Wi-Fi network operators, enterprise and commercial Wi-Fi network operators, end users, the available security techniques to prevent and or remediate those threats, and 3, the extent to which each technique is effective against specific threats, avoids interference with legitimate activity, is easily deployed and or currently deployed. We're wanting to use these recommendations to inform how the Commission can clearly communicate authorized defensive actions. We know clearly that indiscriminate Wi-Fi blocking is not allowed. That's an inappropriate way. People should never think about that as a technique with which they can defend their enterprise network. We want to fill in that gap to the right of Wi-Fi blocking, and that would say, okay, if you can't do that, then what are effective techniques within that? The FCC liaisons for this will be Peter Schroyer and Kurian Jacob, both from the Public Safety Bureau within the FCC. And we look forward to, once we identify the chair and co-chairs, to getting their restatement of the ask at the next meeting.
That's great. Thank you, Admiral Simpson. So I think we made some very positive progress today. So, tip of the hat from the chair here to all of our working groups, all of our chairs. We ratified, 5 working group recommendations today around 911 services, around alerting platforms, around emergency alert systems, security by design, and cybersecurity workforce. So great work today. Our next CSRIC 5 meeting is Wednesday, June 22nd. All of the 2016 dates are already published and posted on the CSRIC 5 website at the FCC. As always, there is monthly steering committee meetings hosted by Teresa Hennessy. Teresa is the chair of CSRIC 5 steering committee with our FCC deputies and the working group chairs to ensure, we maintain some progress or where we're hung up and need some help from the agency or the Admiral, as we did with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we got that help. So that's a good thing to be doing monthly. So if there are no further questions or comments, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today, certainly in person, given some of the Washington, D.C. metro complexities for those that use it. Those on the phone as well, thank you. And I'll turn it over to Admiral Simpson for a closing comment, and then Jeff to officially adjourn our meeting.
Yeah, great. I just want to also thank everyone. I found this very informative today, and there's not a working group that doesn't appear to be substantively getting into the problem we've asked you and providing useful feedback. So we appreciate that diligence and the value that you're providing us. And it's not over till Jeff says it's over.
Amen. That's the law. I don't make it. Hey, we came through this trying day with grace and resiliency. Thank you, all of you that are here in the room, all of you that are on the phone. Please get home safe. We'll see you here in June. Bye-bye.
Thanks.